Hey everybody, welcome back to the Weekend Debrief here on FingerLakes1.com. I'm Josh Durso. I'm joined in studio by Ted Baker. He is the host of Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio, and we are getting you ready for the weekend with all of the news you missed this week. It was a busy one. We had primary elections taking place on Tuesday, and of course that is where we're starting today. Ted, any big surprises, or was there anything that stood out to you after results came in on Tuesday? Obviously, these were not mixed races in any way, shape, or form. We had some Democratic primaries in some of the cities, and then we had Republican primaries throughout the Finger Lakes here. But was there anything that stood out to you in terms of what we saw?
Not especially. I mean, I think the Buffalo mayor's race was very interesting. An out-and-out socialist wins it, someone who was given no chance over the incumbent mayor. I mean, I think in Rochester, it was a referendum on a lot of the corruption and the crime in the city. I mean, it's not very often you have both a mayor and the mayor's spouse under indictment at the same time.
Yeah.
I'm always, and I think we differ a little bit on the low turnout. I think it's a problem, especially in races where there's no viable opponent on the other side. I think there's a problem when 18% of 30% of the electorate or something like that chooses a mayor.
Yeah, and I always say I'm not sold on the low turnout in a primary just because you're talking about, especially in rural communities, you're talking about such a small group of people. I mean, I take like the race for Wayne County Sheriff, which saw a competitive primary. We're going to see the exact same race play out in November because one of the candidates has been endorsed by Democrats. But, I think there were maybe like 4,500-ish ballots cast, not counting your post-election day or post-primary day counted ballots. So, when you think about a county that has a population of, I believe, 90-something thousand, 4,500 voters is a pretty sad turnout. And, I don't necessarily think that that's a reflection of early voting being in play. I think that's a reflection of who votes in early voting. And I think that's kind of the norm that we're seeing. And we saw it established last year with the presidential race, of course. Then President Trump built a big lead, or hadn't established enough of a lead, and that lead was inevitably eaten away. I think this really comes down to how it's promoted. I think the interesting thing for me is this is going to really make a big difference in how the Republican Party exists moving forward and how competitive they are in races, period. I don't think there's a way that Republicans can go ahead with virtually no early voting turnout and also be competitive in races with Democrats. I just don't think it's possible. And I also don't think there's going to be any success in rolling back the reforms, the voting reforms that allowed or cleared the way for early voting to happen in New York State. So Republicans, if I'm one of those strategists, I'm saying, look, we have to figure out how to energize this base of voters who think, if they go early vote, they are effectively one of the other side that they don't like because it's a quote unquote unseemly thing to do to vote early, to not vote on election day because that's when it's supposed to happen, because that's when your parents did it, your grandparents did it. So, that's kind of the existential crisis that I think Republican candidates, period, are going to face moving forward. This year is kind of like an anomaly, I think, in a lot of ways. But the other thing that stood out to me was watching some established candidates, and you mentioned a couple Democrats that were kind of a surprise outcome. But I would say also, as far as local races, Supervisor Ron McGreevey in Seneca County and Tyre, with him losing his primary, that's another one that's, we're seeing voters, especially over the last 2 to 4 years, really shift from not wanting or wanting to see something that was viewed, say, historically as very controlled, very what you see is what you get, to wanting to see something truly different, whatever that may mean to Democrats and whatever that may mean to Republicans. And because of that, we're seeing some outcomes that, maybe we didn't expect to see.
Yeah, I think every so often the public just doesn't like the status quo and wants to change it. That's why every third or fourth presidential election you get a viable third-party candidate that pulls 10%, or a Pat Buchanan or a John Anderson way back in the early 80s. The other thing is, you mentioned the early voting. I mean, it's the Democratic Party's really pushed hard all across the country for early voting, and it was greeted this time around with a great big yawn. In Cayuga County, 11 people, 11 voted early. That's a lot of wasted resources and election offices open. 4,400 registered voters and 11 voted early. The other thing I think this all shows is that personalities drive turnout more than issues do. I mean, the reason we had the massive turnout in the presidential election in 2020 is it was Donald Trump and the Trump Republicans wanting to keep the White House and the Democrats saying that it's a vitally important thing that we take it back. I guess people just don't get so excited about water and sewer bonds and, the day-to-day governing of counties and small towns.
So here's the question then. If you are one of these candidates who won, maybe convincingly, and obviously the city races that we talked about earlier, forget those. I'm talking about the races here in the Finger Lakes, race for sheriff in Wayne County, some of the other races as well. When you take those into equation, do you have confidence? If you're one of those candidates who won something that they weren't expected to win, do you have confidence heading into the general election? Or alternatively, do you need to, even if it was a resounding victory on Tuesday, do you need to take some pause and really think about what your strategy is going to be? Because maybe expect the unexpected is what they should be thinking about is in play right now.
Well, I think you just have to keep working hard because power never gives up power willingly or easily. So, I mean, in some of these cases, you're going to see the big power structure trying to get their position back. In some, like I said, in some races, the primary is the general election for all intents and purposes. I think we're going to see more of this fed largely by young people in the years to come. And we'll talk about this in some of the other issues that we get into. I think there's a growing disenchantment with the way the world works, and more people on the activist side are willing to get out there and say, we want something brand new. We want a socialist. We want a woman who was a single mom in Buffalo. We don't want the same old stuffed suits that we've had decade after decade.
And we've been hearing now for, years. This is, take what Jackie Augustine has brought to the show for a number of years in saying the exact same thing. There needs to be new faces, single moms, mothers, women in general, underrepresented folks. Like you need to get these different ideas into the mainstream.
A government that looks like the people they're governing.
Right.
Yeah.
You kind of hinted toward it right there, but every week we've been talking about unemployment and what has or hasn't been happening, who's going back to work, who's not going back to work. My question, and there's so many different stories that I was sort of looking through while I was coming up with what this topic would even look like. What does it feel? What story feels like is being missed? And the reason why I ask this is because unemployment rates are coming down, but companies big and small are having trouble finding workers. Worker participation is also down, but it seems like there's something unique being reported. Millions of workers are leaving their jobs fully in April. 2.7% of Americans left their job, and that's up more than 1 full percent from a year ago. And if you think about that, a year ago, what was happening a year ago? The pandemic. We were in the heart of the pandemic, and 1 full percentage point more people left their jobs willingly this year than last April, which I think really says something dramatic. And it leaves me thinking, feels like we're missing something in the picture, because a big part of what we're hearing about this whole employment, unemployment, worker shortage issue is that it's because there's this extra unemployment benefit and people are lazy and people don't want to work. But it kind of seems like the opposite of that there aren't enough people who are, frankly, willing to work. And it may not have as much to do with what unemployment benefits they're receiving, but rather the financial situation they find themselves in, given everything that's happened over the last year and a half. Because, one of the things that I've been thinking about the last few weeks, but I haven't said because I've been trying to come up with a responsible way to say it is, even though we saw an absolutely horrific thing play out in 2020 with the pandemic in terms of how many people were out of work, we still were talking about like 80 to 90% of the population retaining their job and not having really anywhere to spend their money. And being put in this scenario where coming out of the pandemic, they are frankly, a lion's share of them in a better place financially than they were before. So, what does this mean? You mentioned while we were talking before we came on here that this may be a simple matter of the employee having more power now than the employer, and there having to be more competition. But I guess I throw the question to you, what does it feel like is being missed at this point in terms of how this is being covered and what the conversation has otherwise been like?
Well, I think, again, it's seeing the forest for the trees. We deal with the day-to-day. So there's so many factors here. Number one, I believe there's no doubt that the supplemental unemployment benefit plays a role in it. I mean, if especially at the lower end of the wage scale, if I make 22, 23, 27,000 a year and I can make 30 or 32 by not working, I'd be a fool. So I'm going to take that time off and not work. Now, that's going to expire shortly. I think when that happens, that'll return a little more equilibrium to the market. The other thing, and you touched on it, is we just spent over a year, and I'll speak for my own household, we lost money in income from games primarily that I normally would have done and didn't. But we also got 2 federal stimulus payments. And as you said, for a long period of time, there wasn't a lot for us to spend our money on. And I think one of the things that's happened is people have gotten used to that. I think people have decided that I can live on less income and have less stuff, and I'm okay with that. I think some people are choosing lifestyle above work. I think to back out and look at the broader issue, what we're seeing happening right now is a fundamental re-examining of the employer-employee relationship and of the central place that work takes up in our lives. Hey, you want to go to the beach? Well, I can't. I got to do some work. Or I got to go into the office today. More and more people are choosing the beach. And then another factor that I just read an article the other day, there's a website called Tech Dirt that deals with tech issues, free speech issues, and a lot of these kind of cultural things. A lot of people moved a significant distance from their employer's office during the pandemic under the belief that they'd be able to work from home. So somebody said, you know what, we've always wanted to live wherever. Say, I always wanted to live in Oswego. Okay, so I moved to Oswego and buy a house, and I like Oswego. And now a number of these employers are demanding that their workers come back to the office. There's still that trust issue. Many employers don't believe their employees will work productively if they're allowed to do it whenever and wherever they want. And a number of these employees quoted in the article are saying, my company hit its goals. I did my job. I got everything done, but still they don't want us to. So some of these people are saying, you know what? I just moved 75 miles away and bought a house. I'm not moving back and buying another house for this job. I'll just look for a job where I live now. So we have, I think I said last time I was here that in my mind there is an equilibrium between the capitalist and the laborer. I think that balance has been out of whack in favor of the capitalist for a number of years, and I think what we're seeing now is it's swinging back. I think that employees are starting to see that they have more power than they think, and they have more options than they think. And I think it's going to lead to a lot of re-examining of the way we do things. I think some employers are going to have to allow employees to work from home, and that'll be a selling point. Hey, come work at my company, and I'll let you work when and where you want. I mean, we were talking just before we came on the air, we're talking about the push for the 4-day work week, and you brought up the point, why are we even talking in terms of a work week? Why isn't it just get your job done this week, and if you decide you want to do it all Sunday night at midnight, or you want to do it Monday through Friday 9 to 5, who cares as long as you do it?
Yeah, and I think a big part of that, or the big part of that hesitancy, is that we tend to think, when we think about work, when the modern human being thinks about work, they tend to think about that sort of manufacturing work that our parents or grandparents' generation might have done or had been more prevalent, throughout decades past. And that required more of a physical, the Henry Ford style 40-hour work week. But we're not there anymore. And it's interesting to me because there's a lot of talk about, how this company or this thing or this change, whether it be remote work or this added element of technology in people's day-to-day work, is going to disrupt what we see or what we consider to be normal in terms of work week and what work looks like. I think in a lot of ways, these employers that drag their feet on changing and drag their feet on actually implementing the changes that their employees want to see will wind up being a bigger disruptor in the space of work overall, because they are going to be the ones that fall first. They are going to be the ones that fail first. They're the ones that will see the greatest staffing shortages, just like in other spaces where we're seeing, I'll use the service industry as an example. I think a lot of businesses, whether it be a burger joint down the street or whether it be upscale restaurant that's seen a lot of success over the years before the pandemic, I think a lot of them aren't being creative enough in how they're actually attracting employees or what they're doing to attract employees. Pay is definitely part of it, but it's not the complete picture. And I think, frankly, I said this before we started, I'd like to just let some of this play out. I'd like to just let capitalism do its thing. This is where we sort of see the change. And obviously some people don't want to see any businesses fail at all, and any business that fails is a reflection of some grandiose, broken, systemic issue. But the flip side of that is sometimes, like you said, I think a couple months ago, maybe we just don't need as many restaurants. Maybe we just don't need as many trinket shops. Maybe we just don't need as many, whatever the thing might be. Maybe it's offices that have managers that think that employees only do good work while they're actually there. And if they're not there, they're not doing good work. Maybe we need a lot less of those.
Yeah, the central principle in our lives is kind of consumerism. Remember, after 9/11, what was one of the first things President Bush said was for everyone to go out and buy stuff. Really? Is that why we exist? And again, we've just spent anywhere from 12 to 15 months or more where we got off the consumer treadmill, and people are looking around and saying, that's okay.
Yep.
I don't need as much stuff. All due respect to the people that run restaurants, some people are going, maybe we don't need to eat out quite as much. And it's, I was thinking when you talked about these number of people leaving the workforce, I'm wondering how many of those are second incomes in a family. So you're a working couple, husband and wife, both have jobs. What would happen if one of them quit the job? They'd lose income, yes. They might not have to maintain a second car. They wouldn't have to drive back and forth multiple times every week. There's always, I used to say when I was working in a radio station in Massachusetts, there was a little bakery that was about a minute walk away, so I'd hit that place 2 or 3 times a week for a cannoli or something. Those things go away. You don't have to buy new work clothes. We all talk about being on Zoom and not needing pants. So there are a lot of expenses that you lose in addition to the income. And I'm wondering how many of these households have decided that one or the other can stay home, and that the lost income, the betterment of your lifestyle is worth those few things that you can't afford anymore.
Well, and I would even take that a step further and say 2 things. One, how many of those people, how many of those jobs were 3rd or 4th jobs, and they only worked maybe once or twice a week, or maybe once or twice every couple weeks.
Right.
For the individual, it's almost inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. Maybe it was something to keep them busy before the pandemic, or maybe it was just something to earn a few extra bucks on like for tips or something like that so that they could, have a little spending cash in their pocket or whatever the case may be. If you've gone a whole year without it, or you've found that it's actually an improvement on your overall life, that you don't do that job, pretty inconsequential for the individual, right? But really like cataclysmic for the business who relies on, say, a dozen of those once or twice a week employees.
I mean, to use a sports analogy, because I'm a big sports guy, when Major League Baseball went on strike for the first time, the first major strike in 1981, and there was no baseball for several months, people found other things to do. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, well, okay, I won't watch the ball game. I'll just go to the beach, or I'll go play with the kids, or I'll go fly a kite.
Yep.
We adjust. We find other things to do. So that's, I think, employers have to entice employees back, and I think businesses have to entice us consumers back and say, okay, I know you've been kind of down in the basement for the last year, but here we are. I think there's been kind of this assumption that once the doors opened up, everybody would just automatically return to pre-pandemic life, and I think what we're seeing is that's not necessarily the case.
And also on top of that, I was reading this week, and I can't recall where it was, but I will throw a link into it, into our newsletter this week to it, because I saved it. A lot of this is affecting what I'll call like professional service employees, people who provide services that maybe like the average person doesn't think of, interact with every day. The marketing people, the communications people, those types of folks, financial folks, all those. And it's funny, a lot of them, according to the numbers, have transitioned to working for themselves. So if your manager is demanding that you come back to work because they don't believe you're going to do your job at home, and you can go do exactly what you do now for yourself and essentially become an entrepreneur where you make all of the decisions, and you can also control your workload so that you have better work-life balance. All of a sudden that becomes much more appealing, and all of a sudden these gigantic companies, which I think maybe is the bigger question moving forward, are we seeing a true shift away from large companies and a real significant shift to small individual businesses where maybe they only have a half dozen clients? I kind of think that is something worth watching. But, it raises a great question, is like, do you want to work for somebody who doesn't believe you're doing your job, or do you want to just work for yourself where you're doing your job and life looks exactly the way you want it to look?
Right. And if I have the choice, if my choice is going to the office Monday through Friday 9 to 5, or work around my schedule and get to see my kids' ball games and concerts and dance recitals, and go out and take a walk with my wife more often than I do now, a lot of people are going to choose Plan B.
Yeah, and I think, there's this desire, one last thing before we move on here. There is this desire, I think, to point to some of the hot button issues that we've seen in politics, or issues that have really divided people in terms of right-left ideology, as big reasons why people are choosing what they're choosing to do. But I really think it's a lot more organic than that. And at the end of the day, people are drawn to what's most convenient and drawn to what's most comfortable for them in their own personal life. The idea that, for example, you don't want to work, the idea that all of these young liberals are just leaving their jobs because they don't want to work for the billionaire company anymore, and it's really not that complicated. It really boils down to people just wanting to create something that's a little better for themselves and a little more conducive.
And have more control over their own lives. I mean, again, if one company won't give me that choice and another one will, that's the one I'm going to go work for. So the people that are all saying, come back to the office, you might not have anyone to come back.
Yep. So Seneca Lake Pure Waters came under fire from other environmental advocacy groups this week for its acceptance of a donation from Seneca Meadows. Peter Mantius reported on it, and it did so pretty extensively. But there's a growing rift between Pure Waters and some of the other environmental advocacy groups that we've seen fight off some pretty significant, we'll say, anti-environmentally friendly projects over the last, say, 5 or so years. That said, the question is, should the infighting be a concern for the folks who are watching these groups ultimately fend off these different projects, whether it be gas storage, whether it be incinerators, whether it be proposed waste transfer facilities like up in Wayne County, the one that was swatted down in Savannah. I mean, should it be a concern about the long-term prospects of having a really stable core group of people to fight these things off? And in my own reflection, it kind of seems like there's two kinds of groups in this environmental pile. You've got the kind that lobby for political action, and are very good at it. And then those that do what people would consider the traditional advocacy work. So like your workshops, your educational classes, your stuff like that, that kind of is less flashy and less attractive to donors, to people who ultimately make, that work possible. The latter is also a lot more costly, and it's not as flashy, so it's harder to promote, arguably just as important. So when I start to think about this, I'm thinking to myself, well, should these other groups even be that critical of Pure Waters for accepting the donation if it was a one-time donation and it didn't, as they suggest or claim, come with any strings attached? I know there's that constant pressure to believe there is that constant idea out there, I guess, that any donation from Seneca Meadows or any monetary support from the landfill ultimately means that you're on their team or on their side when it comes to whether you want to see them shut down or not. But this is one of those interesting things because do we want to see this come at the expense of all of these groups being able to continue to fight off other things that come along, like incinerators, gas storage facilities, stuff like that?
Well, full disclosure, I know almost all of the key players in Seneca Lake Pure Waters Association. They come on my show once a month. And when I heard about this donation, I cringed immediately. And I said, oh, boy, they're going to get a lot of fire from this. So I think... I don't know if they debated it and decided that the money was worth the criticism they'd get, or if they just were a little naive and didn't realize they'd get that criticism. We're seeing it again, to link this to sort of a bigger story, we're seeing this connection now between politics and business, where increasingly people want to know the political leanings of the people they do business with. So if you don't like Jeff Bezos' political leanings, you don't do business with Amazon. If Chick-fil-A is too far for the right for you, you don't go get their sandwiches. You can take it a little bit too far. But I mean, in this case, obviously, look, if Seneca Meadows were coming in today trying to build their landfill, Seneca Lake Pure Waters would be among the first people to condemn the idea and fight to stop it. So in that regard, there's a little bit of hypocrisy there to take the money. On the other hand, Seneca Meadows wants to be seen. They don't want to be seen as a negative force or a polluter. They want to be seen, they're running advertising on our radio station right now, emphasizing the things they've done for the community, the tax revenue it brings in, the employment it brings in. So, I don't have a huge problem with them taking that money. I mean, it costs money to run these organizations. It's like in politics where somebody gets a donation from someone and then we later find out that someone is racist. Should I give the money back? Well, why? If this person agrees with me on some things, it doesn't mean they agree with me on everything. If I accept their money, it doesn't mean I fully agree with everything they believe in. So I think there's some jealousy there too. Probably some of these other organizations wish that somebody would make big donations to them. So I guess at the end of the day, I think it's a little bit of a tempest in a teapot.
It just, to me, it seems too, it seems like too much of a reach because, I'm sure you see it too. Every day, how many press releases do you get from agencies and organizations begging for money, big and small, because they just don't have enough of it.
Right.
Everything costs money, and employees cost more money, and everything else like that. Are we saying that they would prefer, as opposed to accepting, say, a $15,000 donation, that Seneca Lake Pure Waters just has to stop doing X, Y, and Z things?
Yeah, I don't think they think it through. That's the problem, is I don't think they think it through to that logical conclusion. That's if they're going to take $15,000 of Seneca Meadows money and use it to ensure the future of Seneca Lake, then why do we care where the money came from? I mean, if Greenwich wants to start spreading money around to people, should they not take it because they're opposed to what they're doing, or should they take it and use it to do their good works? I mean, that's what, Seneca Lake Pure Waters monitors harmful algal blooms. They educate. They advocate for lake-friendly practices. So it takes money to do that. And I guess if you don't like that they took $15,000 from Seneca Meadows, then you write them a check for $15,000 and they won't have to.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I'm not going to say anything more beyond that because I think that's a pretty fair way of summing that up. We've got an unemployment story to talk about that doesn't have anything to do with who is or isn't working, but rather the money that was overpaid last year. So this week we learned that the state has been garnishing the wages of those who already repaid unemployment overpayments. So earlier in the spring, it was reported by News 10 NBC that the state sent out warning letters to 220,000 people approximately who received too much money between like April and the end of May last year. So they received between $600 and $1,200 too much. It's been really, really, really ambiguous. So some said they didn't have any record of being overpaid at all. Others, as was indicated, repaid and are now having their wages garnished anyway. The letter was really aggressive in the tone that it took and said that, if you don't cut us a check for whatever we say you were overpaid, we're going to garnish your wages. And it doesn't really sound like there was much of a process between when those letters went out a couple months ago and present day when we actually have these overpayments being collected. We're talking about a lot of money. So obviously you're thinking, like, kind of start to do the math. 220,000 people, say even on the low end, $600. You're talking millions of dollars at that point. Question is, should the state just throw the towel in on this? Because that's where I am on this. Like, give up. The Department of Labor has comes out of this entire pandemic with probably the single biggest black eye. I mean, a lot of people want to be critical of what the governor has or hasn't done. The Department of Labor has screwed up in significantly grander style, I think, than the governor even has. And it hasn't been reported on nearly as aggressively. And obviously the Department of Labor falls under the governor's watch. So at the end of the day, it is to some degree his responsibility. But at the same time, you go right back to the beginning, and it was a system that hadn't been updated since the 1970s, relying on computers that were 25 years old, or just not a system that was even ready to do the basic work that it needed to do. And I cannot see upside, because this is going to make the Department of Labor look very bad, especially once it begins to play out on the legal side, where people go to court and start to get money back from the state because they paid twice.
Plus damages.
And the new expense that's going to come back and administering whatever exactly is happening right now, which I have no idea what that is, because the Department of Labor, as indicated, isn't really being totally forthright in terms of what's happening in the background. They're giving some vague answers saying, well, we sent out 220,000 letters and there will be a process, and if not by X date, wages will be garnished, but not really giving anyone an indication of what happened between A and B. And now we're seeing that another gigantic mistake and what's turned out to be a huge cluster. So throw the towel in or keep trying.
No, they should throw the towel in, and what they should be spending their efforts on is figuring out why they can't distribute the right number of checks for the right amount to the right people. I mean, we always talk about, why is it that government can't do these things that the private sector can? I mean, I don't know how many employees Google has or Microsoft has, but I would be willing to bet that none of them get duplicate paychecks. I mean, it shouldn't be that hard to give person X their once-a-month check and person Y his month-a-month check. Why is this so difficult? But just from a fairness issue, if I get paid extra, and it sounds to me like you said, if somebody obviously knows it's extra, I mean, if I got 2 federal stimulus checks 2 days apart, I should know that this was a mistake and probably sit on the second one to see what happens. But in many of these cases, it sounds like people didn't even know. They just, my check comes in, I cash it, I put it in the bank, I spend it. So now you're coming back to people who got an extra $1,000 they shouldn't have, but they've spent it. Yeah. So where are you going to take it from? I mean, it's ridiculous. They should hang it up and work harder to make sure that kind of screw up doesn't happen again.
Well, and we have a lot of unanswered questions still, right? Like, I remember hearing in the very beginning of the pandemic when all of these DOL issues meant that people weren't getting their checks. I remember hearing the governor say they were going to work with the biggest and brightest, meaning Google and IBM and all these other people, to make sure that the state system was upgraded and updated appropriately. And to date, I don't think anything's been done. I don't think any change has been made to the unemployment system. To that end, we still probably every week and a half to 2 weeks see a story about people not getting their unemployment as described and as prescribed by the state's own rules and system.
Yeah, I mean, computers are very good at keeping track of things and calculating things. It shouldn't be very hard to have your database of unemployed people and send out a check to each one each month. I don't know why that's hard. I don't understand what prevents them from doing that, but they need to upgrade and join the 21st century.
Yeah. So we've had a 2 week, 3 week, maybe 3 week reprieve from talking about COVID, directly talking about COVID. But here we are. We do have a couple COVID related stories to talk about. So first up is concert venues around the region like CMAC announced last week and this week that they won't be requiring proof of vaccination for concert goers this summer. That was met with pretty resound happiness, even in especially in the communities where vaccination rates are a little lower and hesitancy is still high. We also had news that low vaccination rates among young people are a concern with the newer, more aggressive strain of COVID that is circulating right now. That is, of course, the Delta variant, which we have seen all sorts of scary things about. But at the end of the day, is there reason to be concerned about the latest COVID news, or are we really starting to get into this thing is over territory?
We're done. It's over. It's almost over. I mean, I think as I described it this morning, the number of COVID deaths per day in New York City is beginning to drop, or in New York State is somewhere down around dog bite territory. I mean, seriously, it's almost gone. The Democrat and Chronicle had a story that picked up on the earlier story. It mentioned Seneca County and places like Romulus, but it also mentioned some of the Hasidic Jewish communities where vaccination rates are low, and a lot of those people are pushing back. For example, in Seneca County, we know that the 5 Points prisoner population was counted as residents, even though the town and the health department have no power over those prisoners to make them get vaccinations. And in some of these Mennonite, Amish, and Hasidic Jewish communities are saying, well, we have a high population of kids under 12 who aren't even eligible for the vaccine. Right. So when you're counting these numbers, it's misleading. So, this variant thing, I've been trying to push back on that for weeks now. Bottom line is, if you're vaccinated, you got nothing to worry about. If you're not, feel free to go give it to other people who aren't, if that's what you want. But we've had, I think it's 79 straight days of positivity rate going down. We've hit record lows 29 times. In New York State right now, we have less COVID than we did on March 15th of 2020 when we were just beginning to learn what this thing is. So my bigger fear is that when we get back into cold weather, about November or so, that we're going to see some stories about resurgence and spikes. There's already people talking about, we got a vaccine, now we have to get a new vaccine for the new variant. Liberal political opinion coming up here. I just think a lot of people, or actually more of a conservative opinion, I guess, but a lot of people just seem highly invested in keeping this thing going. But in reality, in most people's lives, it's over.
Yeah, I think the big question in my mind is, like, what does this thing look like in the fall? What is our situation come September, October, probably less September, more October, November, when we start to get back into the holiday season? I'm starting to feel like we will see higher numbers of COVID, obviously, but we also probably will not see any economic restriction / lockdown / back off in terms of the various things that we saw happen the first time. I think in a lot of ways, because of the economic damage that was done and the amount of federal money that was required to actually keep states like New York alive, financially alive, I don't think we will see that happen again, if nothing else, based out of the concern of what may happen in next year's election, or I should say next year's midterm elections, because it could greatly change or sway the outcome of whether getting big dollar packages through is even possible. So, I think there's going to be a lot of reasons come the fall why we don't see a repeat of last spring, no matter what happens with the numbers. But I do agree. It seems like we're constantly being battered with this back and forth of, oh no, this new variant is coming. It's going to be the main variant in a couple months here, and it's going to be really predominant. And, oh no, all these people aren't vaccinated. But also, oh, if you've been vaccinated, you're totally fine.
We talked about this morning. It's even worse than the Delta variant. It's the Delta Plus variant. I don't know if you've heard about that one. Somebody actually literally published a story. This variant is discovered in India. It affected 22 people.
Right.
I looked up the population of India. 1.4 billion people in India, and they're concerned about a variant that affected 22 people. This morning, the next big story, I don't know if it's the FDA, CDC, one of the agencies is now requiring a warning on the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines about this heart condition that literally is less prevalent than lightning strike deaths. I mean, there's we can all disagree about the sanctions. Was it right to shut everything down? Was it right to make people mask? Was it right to make them distance? Fine, we can disagree on that. But, you reach a point where the thing is over, and it's time for a lot of media that continues to pretend otherwise to stop it. I have Good Morning America on in my studio in the morning, and they spent a good 6 or 7 minutes right at the open of their show today talking about Delta variant and this warning on the vaccine. So on one hand, we have the federal government saying, get vaccinated, get vaccinated. On the other hand, we have the federal government saying, look out, look out, look out. Which is it? Talk about mixed messaging. We're certainly not going to get more people vaccinated if you go putting a scary warning on the vaccine about something that's less likely than being hit and killed by lightning.
I'm glad you made that comparison, because that has been, as someone who got vaccinated and then listened to a lot of folks tell me that it was one of the more, and I not to quote unquote expose people now, but like there were plenty of people in my own life who said, you were crazy stupid for getting the vaccine.
Yeah, did you try sticking a spoon to your head? Were you magnetic?
But that's, both at this point or at some point, I guess, both become irresponsible in terms of, we want to talk about responsible or irresponsible reporting. Both are equally irresponsible. At some point when you're talking about, a variant of a virus that is either, gaining steam in a place that is significantly less vaccinated than the United States is, or if it's something to do with, danger associated with the vaccine that is, exceptionally rare, even compared to typical side effects that you experience with medicines like Tylenol, Advil, aspirin, like the indigestion medicine that you might take so you don't have heartburn. All of these things are so much more, and eventually I do want to also have a conversation about sort of the health and wellness element of this whole thing, because, so much of this conversation about coronavirus has never gone any deeper than, well, we have to think about the people who have pre-existing conditions. I thought for sure that this whole thing would really spawn a serious conversation about the percentage of the population that is living with some sort of legit chronic illness that is otherwise totally preventable or fixable if they just make a couple like minor changes in their life. But that conversation has never come along. And that part to me is the thing that's immensely missing and has been immensely missing. And at some point, on this show, I'm going to rant about that for a few minutes. But
all right.
It's not going to be today, but Monday through Friday, where can folks listen to you, Mr. Ted Baker?
Well, you can get all my commentaries and not have to look at me on the Finger Lakes Morning News on WAUB. That is 96.3 and 1590 AM in Auburn. WGVA in Geneva, that's 106.3 FM and 1240 AM, Monday through Friday, 5:30 to 9.
And if you want to see him, you can see him right back here next week. That's all the time we have for today. Give Ted a listen Monday through Friday and join us back here next Thursday. We will see you then.